The room had been sealed for years, its silence thick, its air unmoved. Dust floated like faint memories in the dim yellow beam cutting through the blinds. The old crime scene felt frozen, held in the pause between a breath taken and never released. The investigator stepped back inside with the slow caution of someone approaching an echo. Nothing here shouted, everything whispered. A collapsed outline of tape lay around the place where Elara Vance, age 24, once rested. The space around it carried a faint scent of old paper and plaster, the residue of time, not violence. For a moment, it felt like stepping into a halted reel of film. Shadows stood still, surfaces worn soft by years of abandonment. The muted hum of a faraway ventilation unit trembled through the floorboards. It was only a trace, but enough to disturb the quiet. Elara's name drifted across his thoughts the way it had in the earliest reports, soft, distinct, and already fading even when first written down. She had been a student in Columbus, splitting time between classes and a part-time archival job. Her life was orderly, documented in neat handwriting across planners still stored in evidence. Her final evening, however, had none of that steady logic. No witnesses, no calls, just a silence too complete. When her case went cold, it carried with it the faint guilt of something missed. He crouched beside the area where she had been found. The carpet fibers were stiff, brittle under his gloves. Light skimmed across the uneven surface as though avoiding it. In the corner stood an overturned lamp, its cord curled like a forgotten gesture. He noted its angle again, the same unresolved detail from decades ago, one of many small things no one could prove meant anything. A photograph slipped from the folder he carried, landing face down on the floor. When he picked it up, the edges cracked softly. The image showed Elara on the steps of her university building, smiling faintly, her posture relaxed. That small curve of expression carried a weight now. It felt like something left unfinished rather than lost. The investigator placed it back in the file as though returning a quiet voice to its archive. The first officers to arrive had done what they could. Their notes were careful, methodical, restrained. Yet the scene remained stubborn, unwilling to yield shape or meaning. Over the years, the case gathered dust alongside it, turning into one more folder in the long cabinets of unresolved events. People changed departments, retired, drifted on, but Elara stayed here. He stood in the exact place where she must have stood last, imagining the soft crackle of old floorboards beneath her steps. The air felt dry, as though holding its breath again for anyone willing to listen. He let the silence settle, then opened the file completely. The paper inside released a faint scent of age, ink fading, pages thinned by time. Every sheet held a trace of the moment when people first tried to understand what had happened. Something about the scene still felt unfinished. Not dramatic, not chaotic, simply incomplete. That incompleteness had weight, an almost physical form that pressed quietly against the edges of the room. He remained still for a long moment, letting the atmosphere speak in the only way it could. Then he stepped deeper into the memory, ready to retrace the path that had gone cold before it ever warmed. 2. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The case had slept for 30 years. It returned to life not with impact, not with revelation, but with a single envelope found in the basement of the old precinct during a routine reorganization. Its label was faint, typed on a ribbon that had nearly lost its ink. Vance, supplemental. The envelope had never been logged. Its presence alone was enough to raise questions. Inside were 3 items: a blurred photograph, a brief handwritten note, and a small metallic object wrapped in tissue. Their quiet simplicity made them more striking than anything dramatic. Whoever had sealed the envelope had done so carefully, as though preserving a fragment rather than hiding it. The photograph showed a narrow hallway, dim, unfocused, taken hastily. The date stamp matched the night Elara was found, though the angle indicated it had been taken somewhere adjacent to the scene, not within it. A figure stood halfway down the hall, shoulders turned slightly, face indistinct. Not enough to identify, but enough to suggest someone had been there at a time no one should have been. The handwritten note was brief, almost hesitant. Didn't include this in the main file. Might not matter, still unsure. The metallic object was the smallest of the three. Under the overhead light, it caught a faint reflection. It was a pendant, simple, circular, engraved along the edge with a pattern that seemed personal rather than decorative. The original team never recorded such an item, and no mention existed in Elara's belongings. The tissue wrapping seemed pulled from a desk drawer rather than official packaging, implying someone had acted alone. When the envelope reached the investigator's desk, he reread the accompanying memo twice. No one recognized the handwriting inside the envelope. The officers from that era were scattered, many unreachable. The appearance of the items was not sensational. It was unsettling in a quiet, practical way. Something small had been set aside. Something small had not been spoken aloud. The case reopened officially the next morning. Returning to the old scene with this new fragment altered the atmosphere. The air felt slightly sharper, the shadows more defined. The investigator examined the pendant again, holding it up toward the thin beam of light filtering through the blinds. Its edges were worn, the engraving uneven from natural handling. It looked like something carried often, not an object placed intentionally at a scene. He placed it against a printed photograph of Elara's personal effects. Nothing matched, not her jewelry, not her habits. This pendant did not belong to her. The blurred hallway image, though ambiguous, hinted at a doorway. A narrow frame, partially open. The original team never included any mention of an open door. It was not a revelation, just a possibility, a shift in the silent geometry of the event. His breathing sounded louder in the still room. He lowered the photograph, tracing its vague outlines with a gloved thumb. The person in the frame had been close enough to matter but distant enough to vanish before the first officers arrived. A choice, perhaps, or circumstance. The note might not matter lingered in his mind the most. Not a confession, not even a clear admission. Just uncertainty. That uncertainty felt like the first honest thread in years. He placed all three items on the open file. Together, they formed something incomplete yet undeniably new, enough to begin again. 3 investigator examines, past reports to identify overlooked details. Back at the archives, the old reports opened like thin layers of sediment, each page settling on top of the next. The investigator sat at a narrow table surrounded by rows of metal shelves. The overhead lights buzzed softly, their glow muted by dust. He sifted through every document, statements, sketches, time logs, treating them like voices from a distant room. The earliest officer notes mentioned a faint scuff near the entryway. At the time, it was dismissed as too unclear to classify, possibly caused by first responders. Reading it now, with the envelope's contents nearby, the mark gained new dimension. He highlighted every instance of small uncertainties. Overlooked measurements, vague recollections, the few lines where handwriting grew rushed. None of it was dramatic, but in quiet cases, the smallest lines often carried the most weight. One report referenced Elara's schedule the week before the event. It listed a string of late evening study sessions, though timestamps from library logs revealed she had left earlier on 2 nights. The discrepancy was not large, but it was specific, a window of time unaccounted for, unnoticed before. Another report described her work in the university archives. She had been cataloging materials related to local oral histories. The folder detailing her assignment remained in police storage, untouched for decades. When he opened it, a slip of paper fell out, an old printout of a schedule showing an appointment she never attended. He paused, letting the implications settle softly. Elara had planned to meet someone, but no trace of that meeting existed in the original narrative. The pendant on the table gleamed faintly. He placed it beside the forgotten appointment slip. Their edges aligned by coincidence, but the visual connection felt symbolic, two unrelated fragments suddenly touching. In a separate binder, a brief witness remark surfaced. A neighbor recalled hearing a soft sound the night of the incident, not distress, just movement. It was documented but never expanded upon. The remark seemed almost nervous in tone, written with pauses. The investigator studied the short statement as though listening to a faint echo. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. The evidence did not contradict the old conclusions. It simply revealed what had been quiet at the time. A pattern emerged, gentle distortions, unspoken moments, small silences. He returned to the blurred hallway photograph. The angle of the light suggested the image was taken just before midnight. A shadow across the far wall implied someone had been standing nearer than the figure shown. That detail, invisible without close inspection, added a new layer of presence. He marked it carefully. As he worked, the faint hum of the archive's ventilation seemed rhythmic, almost contemplative. He felt the subtle weight of responsibility, not dramatic, never loud but present. The evidence was not guiding him with clarity. It was offering him quiet suggestions. By the time he closed the final binder, a fragile map had formed. Brief inconsistencies, missing minutes, a forgotten pendant, a blurred figure, an appointment never kept. The logic did not yet converge, but the silence between the facts was narrowing. The renewed investigation moved slowly, with the precision of a hand brushing dust off a fragile surface. The investigator arranged all viable names from the old files onto a clean board, not for spectacle, but for order. Each name stood as a quiet possibility, none louder than the others. 4 individuals emerged from the muted layers of past statements, each connected to Elara Vance in ways subtle enough to evade strong suspicion decades ago, yet present enough to revisit now. The first was Daniel Hurst, a classmate who had collaborated with her on several archival projects. His original interview was brief, almost perfunctory. He had seemed composed then, speaking in short, clipped sentences. Nothing in his manner hinted at conflict. Yet a newly uncovered log entry, an email exchange from the week before the event, suggested tension over the direction of a shared assignment. Not anger, but strain. His alibi from that night was a late study session, unchallenged at the time. With the case reopened, the investigator sought the old library sign-in sheets. The ink had faded, forming a smudged record of names. Daniel's signature was present, but the time beside it was nearly unreadable. Not falsified, merely unclear. The ambiguity hovered without accusation. The second name was Marina Hale, Elara's roommate during her final year. She had moved out 2 months before the event, citing long schedules, yet her last statement conveyed a faint emotional distance, respect without closeness. Marina had mentioned that Elara had grown quiet about something, though she didn't elaborate. That comment, thin and uncertain, gained new relevance now. Her alibi had been a visit to her sister's place across town. Records confirmed the sister's address, though no one had clearly documented the exact time Marina arrived. It was not suspicious in itself, just incomplete. The third was Professor Leland Croft, one of the faculty advisors for the oral history project. His involvement with students was known to be structured, strict, predictably measured. He had recommended Elara for the archival position. His original statement described her as focused, meticulous, self-contained. He offered a firm timeline of his whereabouts that night, citing a departmental dinner. Several colleagues confirmed the event, though a small 10-minute window prior to his departure remained undocumented. Again, not incriminating, simply a gap. The fourth was Jonas Red, the neighbor who reported hearing a faint movement on the night of the event. He had lived alone, kept odd hours, and was known for being private. His brief remarks in the old report were matter of fact, not dramatic. He had said, "Might have been nothing." The phrasing hinted not at deception but at uncertainty. The investigator now reviewed his background. No recorded disputes, no incidents, no relation to Elara beyond proximity. His alibi had never been questioned because he claimed he was home, reading. There were no witnesses to confirm or deny it. 4 names, 4 possibilities, none of them shaped by obvious intent. They hovered like faint outlines against a dim background, each waiting for clarity. The new evidence, the blurred hallway image, the pendant, the hesitant note, hung above these names like a quiet shift in weather. None of the 4 had acknowledged being near Elara's apartment hallway that night. The photograph, though indistinct, suggested someone had been there. The pendant, unfamiliar, implied the presence of a person close enough to drop something meaningful, unintentionally or otherwise. The investigator examined each suspect's historical behavior, not searching for guilt but for patterns. Daniel's precision, Marina's emotional distance, Leland's structured routine, Jonas's isolation. Not one of them deviated dramatically from who they had been then. That consistency made the task more difficult. Dramatic shifts often point to concealment. Quiet continuity, however, masks everything beneath its surface. He reread Daniel's old interview transcript. Most answers were short. Did she seem distressed? Not sure. Any conflicts? Nothing serious. Each sentence sounded like a stone placed carefully in a line, straight, controlled. Marina's transcript contained longer pauses, indicated by dashes in the stenographer's notes. She was different that week, not upset, just somewhere else. Do you know where she went the evening she left early? No, she didn't say. Professor Croft's transcript reflected academic precision. She adhered to schedules. Deviations would be notable. I don't recall any. His tone on paper seemed detached, neutral. Not affected, not indifferent, administrative. Jonas's remarks were minimal. Heard movement, quiet, didn't look, didn't think. Not helpful, but not dismissive. The investigator stood before the board, the suspects' names lined vertically. He added a new column beside each: motive, opportunity, alibi. Nothing solid filled those spaces yet. The board resembled an unfinished diagram, the kind that carries potential but no direction. He added the envelope items beside the suspect's details. The pendant rested under the column shared by all 4. The photo of the hallway was placed above the section connecting them to the scene. The handwritten note remained unassigned. Its uncertainty belonged to no one and everyone. As he stepped back, the pattern appeared unchanged, not because nothing connected, but because too much remained undefined. Each suspect bore a quiet possibility, and none made enough noise to rise above the rest. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the muted rhythm of archival air. Suspicion here was not a flash of intuition. It was a slow, deliberate movement through fog. 5 clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. The investigation deepened not through revelations, but through accumulations, soft layers of detail forming something more coherent. Each new discovery felt like a shift in light rather than a change in structure. The first clue emerged when the investigator revisited Elara's archived work materials. Her notes contained a list of oral history interviewees organized by date. One name had a small mark beside it, a circle drawn faintly, almost apologetic. The name belonged to a retired librarian who lived 2 blocks from Elara's apartment. According to the original timeline, Elara never completed that interview. Yet a handwritten reminder on her desk calendar, found in evidence, indicated she intended to visit the person 2 days before the event. The investigator made a quiet note. She had been meaning to reach someone, for reasons unclear. This connected subtly to Marina's comment, Elara being somewhere else. Perhaps not emotionally distant, but mentally occupied. Another clue sat embedded in Daniel Hurst's email exchange. A recovered server log, newly processed, revealed a short message sent shortly after 11 p.m. the night before the incident. Its content was professional but urgent, addressing an unexpected inconsistency in the oral histories they were cataloging. The timing placed Daniel in a state of heightened concern, though not necessarily connected to the event. Still, urgency shifts behavior. Sometimes it alters decisions. A more delicate clue emerged from Professor Croft's old planner, retrieved from storage. The pages bore structured entries, but on the week of the incident, one small notation stood out. Not an appointment, a name, written in the corner, Elara. No context, no explanation. The mark was faint, as though written without intention of permanence. It did not incriminate, but it added weight. The pendant, however, remained the most physical clue. The investigator sent it for materials analysis. The pattern was not ornamental. It resembled the logo of a now-defunct student organization focused on historical preservation. Membership lists from the early 1990s were incomplete, but one surviving copy identified 3 of the 4 suspects as former attendees: Daniel, Marina, and Jonas. Croft had been an advisor at one point. The pendant belonged to someone within that circle. Not a stranger, not an intruder, someone known. The blurred hallway image then took on new meaning. The figure's posture, slightly turned, shoulder angled toward the camera, implied hesitation, not confidence. The person was not fleeing but lingering. That suggested familiarity with the space. The investigator pinned the photo beside Marina's old key request form. Records showed she had never returned a spare key to the building's main office after moving out. It was a small administrative oversight, common, easily forgotten. Yet it widened the range of who could enter the building without force. Still, nothing pointed decisively toward any one suspect. Each new detail connected them not through guilt, but through shared environment, shared history. A quiet network of overlapping paths. The emotional layer surfaced through Elara's planner. Alongside her neatly scheduled tasks, one line stood out, almost buried. "Talk to him, don't postpone." There was no name, no date linked, only that small, personal fragment. The investigator placed it beside the forgotten interview reminder and the pendant analysis report. Together, they formed a constellation of small urgencies. The archivist who had supervised Elara at her job added another faint clue during a brief interview. She remembered Elara mentioning she had found something inconsistent in one of the oral histories, a detail that didn't match the recorded accounts. The archivist hadn't pressed her for specifics then. She regretted that now. The investigator returned to the case board. He redrew the lines connecting suspects to details. The connections were faint, but they existed. Daniel, urgency in correspondence, shared academic project. Marina, unreturned key, emotional distance, unexplained comment. Leland Croft, name in planner, structural influence. Jonas, proximity, pendant affiliation. None of these stood alone as definitive, But collectively, they formed a slow drift toward emotional motive, not anger but conflict, not confrontation but tension. He stepped back again. The board looked slightly altered, as if each new line had shifted its center of gravity. A quiet shape began to emerge, not sharp, not decisive, but leaning toward something deeper. Clarity arrived without flourish. It did not break the case open. It slipped in quietly, reshaping the existing lines. The final shift began when the investigator re-examined the old maintenance logs for Elara's building, long lists of routine tasks, signatures, and timestamps. One notation caught his eye. A minor service entry logged on the night before the event, hallway lighting adjustment. The signature was abbreviated, unfamiliar, almost careless. No one had questioned it then. It seemed like background noise in the larger silence. He matched the initials against personnel files from the era. None of the building staff used that combination. The initials didn't belong to maintenance. They didn't belong to any resident. They didn't belong to anyone officially connected to the building at all. But they belonged to someone else in the case. Jonas read. He had lived next door. His job at the time was listed simply as part-time assistant for the Historical Preservation Club, the same organization associated with the pendant. But buried deeper in archived university employment records was a second listing. Temporary maintenance contractor for campus housing, assigned sporadically to student residences. Not a primary job, not steady, but enough to grant him exposure to building schematics and spare parts. Enough to give him practical familiarity with old locks and lighting systems. His original interview had painted him as peripheral, quiet, unobtrusive, barely visible in the narrative. Yet here he was, tied indirectly to the very function that kept the hallway dim on the night Elara was found. The investigator noted the implications, calm but deliberate. If Jonas had access to the lighting system, he could control shadows without drawing attention. He could move through the corridor without being seen. He could linger long enough to be captured in the blurred image, not as an intruder, not as a stranger, but as someone who understood the building's liminal spaces. Still, access did not equal intent. Another subtle detail pushed the shift further. The pendant analysis returned a final note. Trace particles embedded along the back surface suggested it had rubbed frequently against cloth, consistent with being carried in a pocket. But beneath the particles was a faint residue of carpet fibers, matching the color and composition of Elara's apartment flooring. That placed the pendant inside her apartment at some point. None of the other suspects had documented access to her unit. Marina once had a key, but records indicated she returned it years later during a campus sweep of missing items. Professor Croft had no reason to enter the apartment, nor did Daniel. But Jonas lived next door, and the faint movement he reported that night, his minimal, almost detached description, suddenly felt like an echo of something he could not articulate without revealing presence. The appointment Elara never attended intersected with this realization. The retired librarian she planned to meet had submitted an oral history involving discrepancies in local archival practices from years prior, practices Jonas, as a preservation assistant, would have been aware of. Perhaps Elara found something that unsettled someone familiar with those records. Perhaps she mentioned it to the wrong person in a moment of trust. The investigator revisited the transcript of Jonas's original remarks. The pauses, the short phrases, the way he had positioned himself as someone who heard but did not see, present but disconnected. It read differently now, not evasive, not guilty in tone, but cautious, measured. Then came the final, quiet shift. In a forgotten box within the storage annex, he found a narrow envelope labeled MISC. Inside were old keys recovered from campus housing over several years. Most were unremarkable duplicates or outdated models, but one key carried the same engraved numbering sequence as Elara's building. The tag attached was brittle, almost unreadable, but the handwriting was distinct. Red. It was the missing spare key Marina should have turned in years earlier. It had passed into the wrong hands by simple, careless circulation, not theft, not conspiracy. A small oversight, a small misplacement, and it had ended with Jonah's. The twist formed not from surprise, but from logic. The least suspected person had been the closest in structure, routine, and proximity. The one who blended into the building, who maintained systems without recognition, who lived in silence next door. The one who had no explicit conflict with Elara because his conflict wasn't personal. It was circumstantial, an intersection of knowledge, insecurity, and quiet pressure. When confronted with the resurfaced evidence during a new interview, Jonas did not confess in any dramatic fashion. His words remained sparse. "I didn't mean for anything to happen." A pause. "She found something. I didn't understand what she'd do with it." Another pause. "I panicked." The truth came out not as a revelation but as a slow, hesitant unraveling. He had approached her apartment that night with the spare key in his pocket, intending only to confront her about a document she had mentioned in passing. Something he feared would implicate him in minor administrative misconduct, nothing violent or extreme. But fear swelled, decisions collapsed into instinct, and a quiet moment became irreversible. The pendant had slipped from his pocket during the struggle. He had tried to retrieve it but fled when he heard footsteps in the stairwell. The blurred hallway image was him, caught in a moment of indecision. The handwritten note in the supplemental envelope was from an officer uncertain whether the pendant mattered. It had been set aside accidentally, forgotten. The pieces aligned, not perfectly but plainly. The least suspected person was the one woven so gently into the background that no one had noticed the subtle folds in his presence. Truth emerged as a quiet, steady shape, not shocking but inevitable. 7 ends with moral reflection. Truth isn't always visible on surface. The final report rested on the investigator's desk, its pages clean, new, without the fatting scars of older files. The narrative inside was precise, structured, deliberately calm. It outlined the details of a case solved not through breakthroughs, but through patience, not through dramatic clues, but through fragments stitched carefully over time. He closed the folder gently. The hum of the overhead lights flickered for a moment, then steadied. Evening settled across the precinct, turning the windows into muted mirrors. In the reflection, the room appeared subdued, almost contemplative. He allowed himself a moment to revisit the old apartment in memory. The stillness, the dust, the collapsed outline of tape, the space where Elara's presence lingered not as spectacle, but as something soft and unfinished, the kind of memory that doesn't leave loudly. Justice, when it arrived, felt procedural, almost mechanical. It offered no comfort, no restoration. It simply placed events into order, a sequence reconstructed, a truth confirmed, a name written into the column of responsibility. Yet something human remained in the silence around it, a reminder that motives are rarely as large as stories make them. Sometimes they are small, nearly invisible pressures, shaping actions without force, without intention of harm. Fear, uncertainty, misjudgment, a moment slipping out of control. The investigator sat back in his chair, feeling the quiet weight of it. Jonah's Red was not a monster. He was a man shaped by a single fragile decision. And Elara Vance was not a symbol. She was a life interrupted, delicate, thoughtful, carrying questions that now had no place to go. The truth had been buried not by malice but by minuteness, a misplaced key, a forgotten envelope, a faint note written without confidence. None of these were dramatic. None were sinister by themselves. But together, in the stillness of time, they rearranged into something irreversible. He gathered his notes, stacked them neatly, and turned off the desk lamp. The room dimmed, leaving only a thin line of hallway light across the floor. As he stepped out, the faint scent of old paper followed him, the familiar aroma of stories closed and questions left lingering. Some truths, he realized, never appear on the surface. They live in the subtle spaces between actions, in the quiet decisions no one notices, in the thin shadows cast by ordinary lives. The case was solved, but the silence around it, the human weight, remained unresolved, suspended gently in the background like the dust that once floated through the forgotten room where everything began. Justice was done, but closure, as always, stayed just out of reach.